Okay, welcome everyone to this event, which is the concluding event of a big Horizon Europe project that we here at Bruegel, together with, I think, a dozen of partners in total from different universities and institutes around Europe, have participated in. And I think it's one of the most timely topics these days, which is supply chain, which are under so much strain and so much attention these days. And with this event, we want to kind of present the outcome of this research that was conducted over the last 3 years, and then discuss it with stakeholders and policymakers from the European Commission and from one of Europe's leading automotive manufacturers. So we're very happy to have our three panelists here and share the insights from this research with you. So to introduce the panel here, my name is Nicolas Potier. I will moderate this event. I'm a research fellow here at Bruegel. I focus on trade and industrial policy. And with me today here, I have first Holger Görg, who is the leader of this project. He's a professor of international economics at the Kiel University. He was acting director of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy for I think 2 years. And he is a leading researcher on international economics. Then I have next to him Uti Slotboom, who is the Director for Supply Chains and Business Analysis at DG GROW here in Europe. Of course, very knowledgeable and kind of a key policymakers here in this policy domain. And last, I have Jean-André Barbosa, who works for Renault as the Vice President for European Affairs. And he is no stranger to value chains. He worked at DG Trade at some point in his career at the Doha round when we were still in maybe a happier world for supply chains. So for today, I want to start with Holger presenting the results of this research. But just to remind everyone here, this is like always Bruegel events. We want a lively question and answers with our audience, both here in the room and online. And for those of you that are joining online, we have a Slido, which is at slide.do. You can use hashtag global economy and ask a question to this panel. So with this, I no further ado, I give the floor to Holger.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Nicolas, for the very kind introduction, and also to everyone for being here. And let me take a few minutes to introduce you to our project, which has been running for 3 years, and it's just about to finish. And this project was entitled Rethinking Global Supply Chains, and that's exactly what we did. We looked at global supply chains from different perspectives. We were a consortium, or we still are a consortium of 11 European partners. This project was led, as Nicolas said, by the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. But we had partners from 10 European countries, from Oslo in the north to Salento in the south of Italy, and Dublin in the west to Budapest as the most eastern partner in this. And what did we want to do? So the aim of the project was, in a nutshell, to improve our understanding of global supply chains, particularly looking at new measures where we take into account that supply chains are not just in goods, they're not just about Renaults and cars being produced, they're about, and increasingly so, about supply chains and services, and in particular about knowledge. Knowledge flows within, across countries within firms. That's what we wanted to look at, and that's also what we did. So we spent the last 3 years doing this. Summarizing this in 5 minutes is not going to do it justice. Yeah, I should send that message out before I do that, of course. But nevertheless, let me try and summarize and give you an indication of the main outcomes and some of the main results, and then we can delve into the discussion. So some of the main outcomes, of course, we've got a lot of research papers on different topics related to this, and we also provide inputs for the wider community, if you will, and that's provide new data to quantify the role of knowledge, in particular in global supply chains. So we have generated what we call a knowledge input-output table, where we can trace, based on patents in the world, we can see where does the knowledge that's in patent A, where does that come from, and where does it go to? Who's concerned? Who uses these patents that are being produced, and what patents are we using in the production? We have something similar for knowledge chains and open source software, so a very particular kind of services that's produced. And we also have new data and knowledge chains and information on knowledge generation in European universities. So these are data sets that are available for researchers or for the interested public. And what we also did was we looked specifically through a very detailed company survey in different countries in Europe to ask companies, well, what are the shocks you're exposed to? Have these shocks increased over the last while? And how do you organize your supply chain and organize in particular knowledge flows within these supply chains? So this is company survey information that we've also summarized, and that's available to researchers. And using this data, but also using microdata from from a lot of European countries, our partner countries, administrative microdata, we use this information to study how do networks in goods and services look like? What are the interconnections between these networks? So goods and services. So a car producer and the knowledge that's being used in car production and in others. How do firms respond to shocks? We started off with COVID, and we were just talking about this over lunch. That was important 3 years ago. Nowadays, you could almost say nobody cares about it. We've certainly focused our attention much more, unfortunately, on other shocks that are much more recent and much more, much stronger. We also look particularly at innovation performance of firms. How do firms organize and change their innovation performance? Because that's, of course, where knowledge is important. That's where knowledge is generated. That's where knowledge is diffused in chains. We looked at the labor market effects of all of these adjustments and also the environmental implications. The key findings, as I said, I can't summarize 3 years of research in 5 minutes, but I guess there are 3 very important or particular areas where we contributed and where our findings matter. So there's very strong evidence firms adapt their supply chains differently in response to shocks. And I'll go into some more detail in all of these. We also know from our research that knowledge flows and goods flows are deeply interconnected. I'm probably not telling you any news, but it's not just at the company level, and it's important. These links are important, and there are important policy lessons from this. And we also know that innovation is important for resilience. And unfortunately, Europe faces some structural gaps in this. So let me give you just a little more on this, and then we can go into the discussion. So as I said, firms adapt supply chains differently in response to shocks. In our survey, we find that around 60% of firms face disruptions due to COVID and due to the Russia-Ukraine war. And many of those have, as a result of these disruptions, reconfigured their supplier networks in different ways that we can look at. Okay. We know that firms engage in joint innovation and information sharing, and the ones that do that are actually much more likely to adapt their supplier networks. So, and we can see this also in the data, that it's becoming much more important to share information with your suppliers, do joint innovation, and this leads to more resilient, stable supplier-customer relationships. And joint innovation is important. It encourages adding supplier within regions. Okay. What we also find is firms' response to shocks. We find that firms do permanently, so even if we just think of a very temporary shock, for example, a drought in Germany, which is this particular paper underlying this, a drought in Germany for a couple of weeks or months on the River Rhine. This led firms to permanently adjust their supply chains. Okay, and this is important. So even temporary shocks lead to reorganizations of supply chains. And we also find there's some gender dimension to our research. So we find that female-run firms find it much harder to get into export markets if these export markets display some gender biases. So also important for supply chains. There are some limits on how easy it is for female firms to get into these supply chains. Okay, second point, knowledge and good flows are deeply interconnected. An important point that I think is well known, but we have a paper to really make this point. Services trade between the US and the EU is almost as large as goods trade. depends on how you measure it, but it is almost as large as goods trade. Politicians, policymakers seem to forget this, or maybe willfully want to neglect this when they talk about trade balances. Okay. More importantly, there is an interconnection between services and goods trade, and services help firms smooth disruptions in goods trade. And so we studied this using Brexit as a disintegration shock to firms, and we can clearly show that goods producers face disruptions in their goods exports, but they use services exports to smooth this balance a bit. Okay. We also know that the participation in buyer networks boosts knowledge transfer. So knowledge transfer is very important in your supplier-buyer relationship, and this enhances innovation and product quality of firms. And there's a strong correlation between knowledge flows and trade and intermediates. So firms that do buy goods from their suppliers, they're also likely to have some sort of knowledge flows with these suppliers and with their customers, of course, as well. Okay, and this is important because this also means, from a policy perspective, that trade policy and innovation policy and industrial policy interact. They're connected through this. If trade policy affects trade and intermediates, this will have an effect on knowledge flows across countries, across firms. Okay, and we also can show in the research that innovation and production reinforce each other. So there's co-location of physical production and R&D and knowledge flows. Okay, innovation drives resilience, but Europe faces some structural gaps. Innovation fuels job creation and regional growth, especially when it's broad-based and cross-disciplinary. So focusing on very limited research activities may not be the best thing in terms of regional growth. It has to be broad-based. Okay. Global innovation networks are separated still. They are very, very important, but they are separated, in particular between Asian and Western networks, and this puts a limit on how firms and countries can collaborate and progress. And European universities, if I may be so blunt, have a problem. A problem in terms of patenting activities. They're well behind the US, China, other countries in terms of how much what they produce. Okay, innovation is dominated by multinationals. This has implications for local firms that one needs to be aware of. And innovation is also concentrated among these multinationals and these top innovators. Okay. And perhaps a last point on this, knowledge production is very responsive to subsidies and tax cuts. So tax policy, subsidies policy, industrial policy plays a big role for encouraging knowledge production, R&D. Okay. The main policy lessons, I like to put it that way. Everything is connected, and I think that's perhaps something we can discuss. So trade policy, to look at trade policy in isolation is misleading. Trade policy is also services policy. If you limit trade in goods, this will have implications for trade in services. Trade policy is also cooperation policy. If you limit trade in goods, this will have limits on cooperation, this will have limits, this will put strain then on R&D, innovation activity, and so on. So to put it all together, trade policy is innovation policy. And innovation policy and trade policy also has implications for environmental policy. And lastly, it's tax policy. Tax policy is very important because this determines where exactly trade and innovation and all these activities are located. Thank you very much. I think we can take it from there.
Thank you, Holger. Maybe before now going to Uti and her thoughts on this, maybe we can spin out of this last slide, because I think one of the really interesting things that have changed over the last couple of years was the switch of like trade policy. Like everyone was talking about supply chain, but yet trade policy in some way was kind of boring. So we were negotiating for 20 years Mercosur, and we're not getting it through Parliament, and all the action wasn't actually what trade policy people call like autonomous trade measures were actually not designed by the trade policy people, but actually by other department. And in some way, the action was more industrial policy, more on these domestic measures. We now live in a different time with the Trump administration, but for DG Grow, which is kind of the department that is in charge of the internal market and a lot of these in innovation policies, industrial policies, how do you think about this link between value chains and domestic policies?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. It is a very interesting study, very good conclusions, which of course rhyme quite a lot with what we have been doing. So I am one of the EU officials from the other department, not DG Trade, but looking at the final slide, I also had to think that when I think of industrial policy, because my Directorate General works on single market industrial policy, entrepreneurship and SMEs. So industrial policy is also very much what we do in trade, how trade deals are negotiated. This has a direct impact on our industry. It is knowledge policy, it is environmental policy. And we do work very closely with our colleagues in DG Trade and other areas. After giving you a lot of compliments, maybe I can take a few moments to advertise a bit the work that we are doing. I'm hosting our chief economist in my directorate, and they have focused in the last years, as you said, on the very fashionable topic of supply chains, starting with bigger structural analysis and moving to more short-term monitoring. On the more structural things, my colleagues looked at changes in supply chains after the pandemic. What has happened with the structures of EU trade? The geopolitics are changing. Are we still trading with the same trade partners? Are we turning inside? What has happened? There's a paper on our website, so basically anything that I say you will find on our website, this little commercial spot, single market economic papers. But what we found was that the EU, after the pandemic, has started to trade more with the close neighborhood, so with the candidate countries, with the countries in the close neighborhood, but also with the countries with which we have a free trade agreement or other partnership agreement. And we are trading less with countries with which we have no trade relationship, and in many cases, even more so, these are countries against which the EU has taken sanctions. And this last group of countries, which I would call non-partners, we measured a 1 percentage point decline in their share of EU imports per year. And this is likely to continue if we were to update the data right now. So of course, in policy terms, what we have seen on supply chains has pushed the whole Commission to find more partnerships. Our colleagues in DG Trade, with our help and with the help of the whole House, negotiating more trade agreements. But we also have raw materials partnerships. We have industry policy dialogues. We try to intensify our work with our partners across the globe. Then looking at more what keeps companies busy, vulnerabilities. We also analyzed the critical goods. We really tried to calculate from trade data what the products, raw materials, components are that are needed for EU industry, which are not produced, or at least not in any significant amounts inside the EU, but which are essential inputs into production, and which we only get from 1 or 2 third countries. And we found about 204 such products, amounting to 9% of the total import value. These are often electronic components. There are a lot of critical raw materials, rare earth, pharmaceutical ingredients, and the origin of these vulnerabilities is in more than 50% of the cases, you will know it, China. So the China dependencies, we have really put it on the map, and this has led to efforts to diversify our trade agreements, but of course risk management is in the first place for companies, it is not for civil servants. So for companies the lesson is diversify. And in parallel the Commission is putting a lot of efforts into pushing EU production where it is relevant. Some years ago the Commission adopted the CHIPS Act on medical supplies. There is the Health Emergencies Act. We have put in place a Critical Raw Materials Act, and we are trying to do what a government can do, but it is in the first place for the companies to work on their supply chain vulnerabilities. Moving more to short-term monitoring, we are also looking at sudden price increases in our imports. We have access to short-term customs data, and we do short-term monitoring to see where volumes suddenly shrink, where prices go up. And this is part of a larger agenda, which was, I think it's fair to say, kicked off by the pandemic. We have a preparedness strategy in place. For the single market, we have in place Resilience Act, which involves contacts with the member states' emergency authorities, protocols for crisis, rules on how to make the single market function in the next crisis so that we are not faced with a fight for vaccines or face masks as happened, but that member states can work together and supplies go where they are most needed. And of course, if I conclude with some of the general policy priorities, what you mentioned is very much also the policy priorities of the Commission. After the report of Mario Draghi on European competitiveness, the Commission's agenda is very much about his three priorities, starting with innovation, decarbonization, and economic security. And the last one is very much about supply chain vulnerabilities. With that, we try to promote EU production, more partnerships, but also for raw materials in particular, more recycling, circular economy. Rather than exporting waste, let's see what we can extract from waste and recycle. And my final word, single market, is the most important thing in this. We are doing a lot to deepen the single market. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Then let me turn to Jean-André. Like you represent one of these multinationals that is so crucial both for innovation, but also, as we see in some of this research, for actually structuring supply chain, that these multinationals that decide through their supplier relationships. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, on the one hand, how your thinking has changed about how to manage the kind of volatilities that we see or the kind of uncertainties we see in supply chains. But at the same time, also what you would like to see from policymakers. We just heard it is not the job of the European Commission to manage the vulnerabilities for your companies. But at the same time, they are supposed to help you. So what is the thing that you would like to see from policymakers?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this event and to give a little bit a view of what the industry, the view of the industry on this extremely actually large topic. So I will probably never go to the detail that you have gone presenting the results, and I'm looking forward to reading, of course, the report. Now, for us, a supply chain, what is it? Well, first is recognizing that a customer is not buying a semiconductor or a battery. The client, the customer, is buying a car. So you need to have a car, and to make a car, you have a lot of components. At the end of the day, we're like Lego, right? We're assembling the cars. And just to give you an idea, we are working today with 500 tier 1 companies and more or less 200 strategic service providers around the world on 25 different industrial locations around the world. It's just to give you an idea of what it means, a supply chain. Because at the end, a supply chain is getting the right quantity with the right quality at the right place, the product you need. And this is what makes it so complicated. Now, in the case of the automotive sector, of course, I have spoken about the global footprint and the supply chain complexity, but we should also understand that we are undergoing a structural transformation as we are going from a traditional model, which was the internal combustion engine, to a totally new one, which is the electric vehicle, and I really say it's a new one. You know, how long do I have? Because when you give me a mic, then I don't stop. Okay, so actually, when you take, let's suppose you want to retrofit an internal combustion engine into an electric vehicle, actually you have to change everything. So you cannot really, it's just, this example is to show you that we're talking about two different animals, right? Because it's different in terms of the components, the inertia, the way you design them, the way you integrate the software into it. So we have actually added a huge amount of complexity into the supply chains. To this, and especially on the electric side, on the electrification side, and this was mentioned as well by the Commission, we have dependencies, and these are we are seeing today the importance of these dependencies and how today there are sectors, there are really points in the process which are extremely dependent. Refining is one, for instance, in terms of the refining of the rare earths. So these are geopolitical risks which today we see are taking another level in terms of the importance for the companies. So everything is complexifying. It is really complexifying. Now, Renault Group has also always thought its supply chains in terms of ecosystems. That means that when we are going to develop a supply chain, we're also trying to develop the local regional supply chains. So we are trying also to bring knowledge, but also economic developments to the regions where we are installed. This means that we have already ecosystems that have been created over decades. And these ecosystems are working today very well. And we must make sure that any new rules that we are going to take in terms of how we consider our mitigation of the dependencies, that they will not be totally disrupted. And here I would like to come to one of the topics which seems to be quite high in the agenda today, and that Renault Group is constructive and supportive in this, is the local content. We hear a lot speaking about local content today in Europe. I'm not sure we have seen a totally proper definition of what is today considered as local content. Maybe DG Grow can tell me the opposite, but I'm not sure we know exactly what we're meaning. Now, Renault Group, over the past 2 years, has the two cars of the year, of the last two, the Scenic in 2024 and the R5 Electric 2025. Both are electric cars. No other brand has done this. So that's just a marketing to say, whoever tells you we are late with electrification, they are wrong. So we have the two latest cars of the year, and these two have the certification guaranteed origin France, which is a label which is given in France. Today already the majority of the suppliers, and I think I need to check my notes, but I think it's 70% is already, yes, 70% of the purchasing value of our components is already sourced in Europe. So the idea that today we are totally sourcing everything outside is not necessarily the truth, and here it's very important we're all clear about what we're talking about when we talk about local content. And here I would say, you ask me, what do you need from the regulators? And I think today it's indeed a moment where maybe we need to change the way we look at the regulation of the automotive sector. My CEO has been saying this in Brussels last week. The regulation of the automotive sector of the past decades might need a change today if we really want to achieve the objectives we have in terms of the electrification and the decarbonization. Concerning the supply, I would say there is a need also for a change. We need to understand that sometimes targets do not create markets. And we have the impression in some cases the Commission believes that if we are trying to impose targets at a certain point, and you go to the CRMA, and we have a lot of different regulations today who set targets to the stakeholders, but it might not be enough. And I take the example of the rules of origin with the UK, so that were negotiated at Brexit. 2 years ago, the OEMs came to the Commission and said, look, we have a problem. If we do not change today the rules of origin that will apply us from 1st of January 2024, we will all have to pay 10% tariffs in our exports to the UK because the battery is not European. After quite some months of tough discussion, exchange of data, the Commission agreed, and we had a 3-year extension of the provision in place, which means that European cars were considered European, even if the battery itself was not complying with the new rules of the Brexit. But the Commission said, you're not going to do that to me again. So in 2027, there is a lock-in clause, so you will not be able to change this before 2032. And the idea was, okay, we're not ready, but this will necessarily create the refining upstream sector that we need. The problem is that today we see that this sector is not yet there, and that we will have an issue in 2027. And here I can quote Politico. I think it's Politico was mentioning already this morning on the UK side, but probably it's the same on our side. So my question is, let's be very careful when we're going to put in place conditions which are there to help the European ecosystem, and we as a European company, we're absolutely in favor of that. But let's be very careful, because competitiveness today is a must. Supply chains are global, and we need to make sure that we're competitive around the world, and that actually our customers can buy our products at the end of the day. So I think I have been long enough.
Thank you. I want to go back to Holger to give him the chance to respond to the two interventions, but I also want to maybe bring back the discussion a little bit to this question of knowledge and the link between knowledge and supply chain and knowledge and goods. I mean, in some way, I feel if you look at the Trump trade policy, for instance, he's very keen on raw materials in a kind of very 20th century sense, that it's about steel and copper and these kind of things. But actually, if we just look a few years back, we were talking all about services, all about knowledge economy. So there's a bit of a switch here, but I think one of the key outcome of this research was that these things are very much linked. So maybe you can say a few things about how, even though we now are discussing a lot of tariffs on goods, what does it actually, how does it mean, what does this discussion mean then for services?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think to come back to the first intervention and the mention of the Draghi report, I think that's also important, because there is also implicit at least a distinction. So as you said, one of the aims or one of the recommendations is innovation, foster innovation. Another one is economic security. So economic security, I think, for a lot of people means we have to reduce dependencies, cut ties, cut trade ties, or reduce them. And that will make it more difficult to innovate. So that's the link that is important, because they are interconnected. So we have to keep this in mind when we talk about economic security, and I'm not saying we shouldn't. We need to talk about economic security, but it has to be thought that we always have to keep in mind that there is this link to innovation, to knowledge transfer, which then obviously also has implications for growth. So it is important, and that's an aspect I think that's neglected in the discussion when we talk about economic security. Brings me to Trump. It's also implicit in that, of course. So Trump is very much about, as I said, reducing trade deficits with countries, and it's trade in goods only that he's concerned about. And that leaves out this whole aspect of services trade that is important in itself, but also that this trade in goods that he's cutting has implications for knowledge transfers, has implications for the innovation ability of the US and of other countries as well. And I think a very important example of this is where he actually does go into cutting knowledge ties, which is the limits of exporting particular technologies to China and vice versa. So this will have important implications, long-term implications, because this obviously will stifle innovation activity, ability, both in the US and in China, but also connected through these supply chains, and you said they're worldwide. This will have implications for worldwide growth that need to be then balanced, need to be taken into account, and need to be thought about by the EU. What are the implications of the US limiting the exports of technology to China, what are the implications for Europe? I think they're important, and perhaps we're not really thinking enough about it. We're just concerned, it's enough of a concern, of course, but we are concerned about the tariffs he's putting on the EU, of course, but we also need to be concerned about these other things, because we are in a global world still, and I think for a long time to come, we are in a global world, even if now we have these trade and industrial policies that are very protectionist. So that's very, very important, and that's really, I think, the main outcome of this project. These links are there. Trade flows do not move in isolation. They are connected to knowledge flows. They are connected to innovation activity, and the other way around, of course. Knowledge generates then also trade flows. And that's important, and that's an important lesson for policy, to also think about policy responses to all of these shocks, to all of these trade policies, to all of these protectionist measures that we see around the world.
Thank you. Let me give the floor back to Uti. I want to ask a little bit about this. So this question about actually where is the value added and how do you capture that as a EU? I think the way we thought about this in the knowledge economy in the past was a lot of the value added is nowadays actually not in the production of goods, but in the design and the R&D activities. We see in part of this research that these things are linked. Nevertheless, we have this big gap from what sometimes called from lab to fab, that we have good research in Europe, but we don't really get it to market. So how do you think about addressing these shortcomings?
Going back first to the single market, where you mentioned knowledge and innovation. Now, the President, in her State of the EU speech, which for us is really the launch of the work program for the year to come, she identified 6 areas of priority for the single market and announced that we go for a roadmap with very ambitious targets and timelines, and it's all about services. Our economy has been servitized, and what is production of goods integrates a huge amount of services inputs. And if somebody says that services are forgotten, maybe also in the discussion of our trade balance with the United States, we do have a trade surplus in goods, but we have a huge trade deficit with the US in services, and that's really an area where we need to invest more. One of the 6 areas that we now have on our work program for the single market is the so-called fifth freedom, which is exactly about the movement of knowledge, researchers, maybe data inside the EU. If I can pick up 2 other things, when you mentioned the economic security agenda and maybe suggested that this makes us more closed and inward looking. This is certainly not the purpose. The response so far has been, let's diversify. If we are too dependent on one import source, let's go for a more aggressive negotiation of free trade agreements with India, with Indonesia, Australia. Let's have more partnerships. But also our definition of economic security has 4 different angles. And one of them is the supply chain vulnerabilities. Another one is addressing the risk that if we have a vulnerability, that a third country would abuse it through economic or trade coercion and start using it in an unfair way against us. The third category is strategic technologies. Are we exporting all our knowledge? On which terms? Can we become too dependent on imported technologies which we no longer control and which may control us? And finally, the last angle of economic security, infrastructure. We have seen a lot of sabotage of cables, critical infrastructure, other events, and this is also part of the economic security agenda. if you look at EU trade with the rest of the world, we have not become more closed. We are as open as ever, but recognizing that this is also a vulnerability, because we also have a vulnerability in terms of export incomes. And maybe the last thing, if I can say a few things about your very interesting research, because with the European Investment Bank, we are also working on annual supply chain surveys, and it is a survey that has a coverage of 13,000 EU companies. And what we have seen in the last edition is that actually supply chain disruptions have halved in size in raw materials and in logistics, where in 2023, 1/3 of the companies reported that they suffered from supply chain disruptions. In 24, this had already halved. And now if we ask the companies where the problems are, the lack of demand is another issue, and the huge economic uncertainty is another issue.
Thank you. Before I open the floor, I want to give the mic back to Jean-André. Maybe to give you the opportunity to respond to the previous points, but I also may want to hear a bit from you about how does a company like yours think about investment in like an environment of such high uncertainty? I mean, if you're building a new factory, you have long lead times, you have to think about very long recoupment of these investments. If you don't know if the tariff rates change by the day, if policy is so uncertain, what is the effect on that, on your thinking about how to structure your supply chain?
Well, I would say that if you take the automotive industry as a whole, and Renault is part of it, we have been investing like crazy over the last years, because we have the regulators have taken the decision that we need to electrify full speed, because in 2035 only EVs, or let's say zero tailpipe cars, can be sold. And I would say this, we are playing the game. We have been investing in production lines, in factories, in supply chains, all these years. And this is, as I mentioned, why today we are in a position that we are able to see every day a little bit more in the streets, a wider variety of electric cars from OEMs. I think the total figure is 250 billion that have been already invested by the automotive industry for electrification, which means actually here we are not asking ourselves questions, we're just trying to do it. So I would say this has not necessarily changed in terms of the investments. Now it, of course, now plays a game in how do we structure the supply chains. An important point here, and this a little bit recoups, I think, very much the section of the knowledge, which is very important. The message of Renault Group here is we are late in comparison to other competitors that today are doing things better. The only way we can catch up this gap is learning from them. So we need to go and understand how they do, and then try to do even better. That's the idea, right? And this is, for example, what we have been doing in the development of the Twingo, which is for release next year. Will be presented not so very soon. And we have a record time of development of this car, which is less than 2 years, when before it was multiples of that to develop a car. So I also think that it's part of the new way of thinking is let's go and try to catch up with the others. We also understand that we need to learn also in terms of technologies. So probably we need also partnerships where we can ensure that there is a way to catch up on technology. So probably with technology transfers or these kind of processes, because otherwise it will be very difficult in isolation to be able to catch up the gap. We usually said we have to catch up 2 generations in one. So we have 1 generation of cars now to be at the top level of what is expected from us next time. So this is playing in everything. Now, also one thing on the supply chains, and I will stop there, is that remember always that part of the mitigation of the risks of supply chains is also diversification. When you have a supplier, usually for one part, you try not to have only one supplier, but different suppliers. If you limit the geographical distribution of these suppliers, then you're increasing actually the risk as well. So it's a very important principle of the supply chains organization is to have always a very active panel that is checking the competitive offers of everybody, because at the end of the day, this is part of the mitigation of the risk, especially for those suppliers which are on strategic supplies.
Thank you. With that, let me open the floor. Let's see first, we already have 2 questions online, but let's see first if there are questions here in the room. We have one over there.
Thank you. Aleksander Sikowski from the Reform Institute in Poland. I have a question regarding technology transfer, because we've heard that it is connected, yes, global supply chains, production, and it seems very clear that especially Chinese manufacturing base has gone like a generation or maybe more. Now we're talking about, okay, we want to buy European, so obviously FDI flows will come here. And I understand that there's also an idea to have some requirements for that FDI. And I understand that we heard that it's not always automatic that if you have FDI, if you have a parts of supply chain here, you actually get the knowledge transfer and you had overvalue and innovation. And I think that today we have great set of panelists who can maybe say from their perspective what would be the key requirements if you had this to decide what would be key requirement for inbound FDIs to actually ensure this knowledge transfer, reverse knowledge transfer to Europe, so that we get to benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have more questions here? Please. No more questions? There we have one. Yes, please.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the interesting discussion. I'm Corey Jord from the DG of International Partnerships in the European Commission. I had sort of 2 parts of the question. The first one was from the research, if you could say anything about the evidence of kind of nearshoring so far, if I can call it that. And secondly, what do you think from the private sector angle if the risk of sort of a more interventionist economic policy that has become quite trendy in many places in the last few years, even if those focus on particular strategic sectors for the time being, is there a risk uncertainty embedded in that those policies and the sectors prioritized could change in a few years, so that would maybe lead to risk aversion and things like that? Thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions here from the room? I don't see. We have one there, please.
Hi, my name is Diana. I'm at Deloitte Legal, and my question is, when thinking about or rethinking about global supply chains, what is the focus or what is the importance of having the product made in Europe? Because if you're going to rethink your supply chain, right, and or nearshore or friendshore or working with our neighbors, how is that ultimately going to impact the origin of the good? Can we really call it made in Europe, and what is the focus or the approach when doing that? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, this ties in with another question we had online. So we always have our questions from Slido, and there was also a question about basically for in the case of the Green New Deal, what role could made in Europe or made in EU solutions play for this? So I think this is like a 2-parter question. I don't see any more hands here, so maybe you can go back to the panel. I will add one other question here, and you can choose which you want to answer. So, which is basically about CRM. So this whole question about, why is our CRM policy not working, or what is kind of the approach there? What do we need for this actually to succeed? That would be another question. I don't know, maybe we can go in reverse order. We can start with Jean-André.
So actually, I don't know with which question to start. I think a very valid question is what can we call the Made in Europe? I think today, and this refers to what I was just saying before, today when we speak about local content, it's very difficult to be against, and we're in favor of this, because who can be against? So we are especially, I told you, 70% of today suppliers in volume are in Europe. Now the question, and the devil is always in the details, so what are you going to call a made in Europe, right? It's like in the batteries. If the CAMs and the pre-CAMs, so the active cathode materials are not European, your battery, even if it is assembled in a gigafactory in Europe, will not be European, according to the rules, for instance, of the UK-EU agreement. So it's there where we need to discuss. Now, I think what we're forgetting at the end of the day is that, again, the customer is buying cars, not batteries, not semiconductors, not cables. And there will be no need for a European supply chain if we are not able to sell our cars. And this is something that sometimes I think we forget. So we have all interest that the cars that are manufactured by the European OEMs are competitive. Also because today, and we forget this also very often, the automotive industry has a very positive trade balance for Europe. Without the automotive industry, at least the last figures I checked, the trade balance of the EU would be negative. That is the impact of the automotive industry. So we can only do this if we're competitive also on the export sector, which means at the end of the day, what we need to make sure is that on the factors of production, on the production factors, we have a competitive advantage, or at least not a disadvantage. Today, the problem is that if you check the production factors along the value chain, you don't find a lot where you have a competitive advantage in Europe. This is why we have proposed, in case we want to go for more localization or, let's say, EU shoring of the production, to create, for instance, Green Deal zones. That could be on the model of the special economic zones that you see in other countries and then help to redevelop the industry of these countries. Because this would go to the root of the issue, and the root of the issue is the competitiveness of the different supplies that go into the car. And at the end of the day, this is what can make a difference. So I think I answered these questions. Maybe it's enough, but I can
yeah, maybe if one of this question I think you would be well placed to answer would be basically, what are you doing, what is your strategy when it comes to critical raw materials? Besides from the policy that comes from governments, what you as an industrial company are doing to mitigate that risk?
So just to be also clear, because this sometimes is also not known, is that the OEMs as such are not procuring rare earths themselves, because we depend on the tier 1s and 2s that are in charge of producing the different products which are made with this, and in particular the magnets and all this. You know, the issue today is on the magnets. So of course we are looking into this very carefully, but it's very difficult to control a value chain over so many levels. We are, of course, involved in battery production in the EU. We have a share in one of the big battery producers projects in the EU, which is Vercor. So we're absolutely engaged and committed there to be a part of the story as well. So we are looking into all possible ways of developing the value chain, making it more resilient, European. And I think that's not only Renault. I think this is also something which the whole OEMs are doing.
Thank you. Let me go to Uti. So I think there's a couple of questions here for you. I mean, one would be kind of, how is the European Commission thinking about forcing technology transfer, which was something we complained about the Chinese doing for a long time, and now the European Commission is openly talking about only wanting investment that include technology transfers. But also, if you can talk a little bit about what are the risks. I mean, we had a very contentious debate in the last mandate about industrial policy. Your house was one part of this debate. How do you think about these risks of two interventionist policies? What do you think is the right approach? How do you see that balance?
Thank you. Starting with the FDI, and maybe just taking one step back to say that we have a regulation in place now which allows us to screen incoming FDI, but the current legislation only looks at FDI flows from the perspective of security and public order, and the whole competence is in the hands of the member states. So what we are doing at the EU level is coordination, alerts, discussions with the member states. There is indeed a discussion, and this needs to be a discussion with the member states, because in reality it is each member state which decides what investments can take place on its territory. And if I can say from our perspective, Europe needs to defend its own interests as well, in seeing that when FDI flows come into the EU, it is also in the interest of the EU, providing jobs, maybe joint ventures, R&D activities, technology transfer. Whether and how other conditions or rules could be put in place is too early to say, but clearly this is a topic which is very much on the radar screen of our political bosses as well. If I can add one more thing on FDI, Europe used to be the top location for FDI inflows. And in terms of holding FDI stock, we are still doing very well. But if you look at the annual flows, we have lost out, and in the last 2 years, FDI inflows have been close to zero. I think 2 years ago, there was more FDI pulled back than was coming in. So we also have to work hard on the single market and on our attractiveness as a location for FDI. If to my colleague from DG INTPA, if I can just add on the nearshoring, that we have a paper on the supply chain tectonics, which shows that there is evidence of nearshoring, and happy to give you the link, but it's also on our website. I would like to add to this that we are also very actively working on EU enlargement. We have candidate countries on the east. We are working on legislative alignment so that they could be part of the single market for chosen industrial goods, which are in their interest and in our interest, already before they formally join the EU, so that we would expand our market and our supply chains towards the candidate countries to anticipate accession. Then what can I say about interventionist industry policy? I think our previous commissioner said that we must end the period of naivety when everybody is subsidizing the rules-based world trade order is quickly eroding. Europe must defend its own interests. And on that basis, we have looked at what is strategic for the EU, and there have indeed been sectoral initiatives on chips, on critical raw materials, Net Zero Industry Act. And although the jury is still out on what is strategic, if we can't address everything at the same time, and if the horizontal measures, better regulation is not enough, how do we pick? And of course, in the Draghi report, you saw a list of is there a technological risk? Do we have industries which are so big and employ so many people that we cannot let them die? Is there an infant industry argument? But he also clearly said that if there is a sector where Europe has lost its competitive advantage, then maybe it makes no sense to support that in competition which has already been lost. In our own, now coming back to my own little territory in the Commission, when we defined strategic for our vulnerabilities analysis, we looked at anything related to security, health, and issues which relate to our green and digital transition. If you see where we are dependent on third country imports, if you just look at trade flows, you end up with Christmas lights and garden furniture, and these are things that clearly we don't consider strategic.
Thank you. Last but not least, Holger, I think there were quite a lot for you in there. I mean, there was the question about if there's evidence for nearshoring, but also you've done quite a lot of research yourself on technology spillover, so I really want to give that question to you. And lastly, about your, from like this kind of analytical academic vantage points, how do you think about the balance between two interventionist and right amount of naivete? What is the right balance on kind of interventionist policy?
If I knew the answer to that, I probably wouldn't be sitting here, but somewhere else in some boardroom. But let me come back to this. But let me start perhaps with not disagreeing with you, but perhaps offering a different perspective on nearshoring. And we have the experts here in the room who actually did the research, but as far as I interpret our work, both on this survey as well as other things that's been going on in the last 3 years, or certainly in the survey, it's very clear firms do adjust their supply chains a lot. There's a lot of churn going on, dropping and adding new suppliers. But there's no clear geographic dimension to this. So it's happening everywhere. I think the clear pattern is firms get out of Russia and perhaps go a little bit more into Eastern Europe in terms of looking for suppliers, but that's the only bit. Otherwise, I think Andre mentioned that as well. It's diversification. You look around, and if your particular input at a particular quality, at a particular price is being produced in China, then you go there. Otherwise you don't. So I think that's why I would also be very interested in seeing and reading this research. So I'm intrigued because we don't find any clear evidence for nearshoring or friendshoring or any of these buzzwords. There's a lot going on, yes, in terms of changing shoring, but we don't really see a clear pattern. And perhaps that's good in terms of diversifying, keeping the supply chain diversified at the macro level. And I think diversification to some extent is also, I think, an important buzzword for the question, how do we facilitate technology transfer? I think I wouldn't call it forcing. I don't think forcing works. I think that's what most of the evidence I know tells us. But it's, I think, about facilitating. So facilitating diversity. So I think you would want to have companies that have a lot of different activities in their plant or in the production plant here. So including services, including R&D, including knowledge creation, and also doing their production, of course. And this will then facilitate, this will enable, this will create the potential for the technology transfer to take place in different areas. So I think that's important. And then facilitating again in terms of actually having access to this. So I think what doesn't work is putting these companies out in some industrial park somewhere in the middle of nowhere where they're on their own. No, they need to be embedded in the local ecosystem, I think you called it, where they have a lot of contact and physical, face-to-face contact with their suppliers, with other companies, and so on. That's how technology transfer works. And that's also something we do find evidence in these surveys, that the face-to-face contact, or saying the reduction in face-to-face contact that firms have experienced since COVID is actually can be detrimental to technology transfer, to knowledge transfer with their suppliers, because it's just not the same level of intensity of contact if you're in a video call or in an email rather than talking to them person to person. So I think the question should be, how can we facilitate technology transfer, not how can we force technology transfer through whatever kind of rules and regulations we want to put in, but how do we facilitate it? How do we make it easy for these companies to do it? Because as you also said, companies do want to exchange technology. It's beneficial for all of them, and it's always a two-way or even more way relationship in this. It's not just going from one to the other and only one benefiting. It's there are many ways. It's not a one-way street.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid this is all we have time for, but and this is the end of this Rethink project almost, but it's not the end of this research, so I think there will be much more things, unfortunately much more economic shocks to study. But I want to encourage all of you that are interested in this. We have a webpage that is rethink-gsc.eu. You will find all of the papers that were mentioned in this presentation there. Some of them are not yet published, but will be published in the next week. So if you're interested in this topic, please go there. And of course, you find also Holger and my research on our representative web pages, and of course also the Commission. So thank you very much to all the panelists and for all of you for being here. And I think this is a long-going conversation that will go on for a while. Thank you.